In today's video, I'll show you how I choose a scene to paint when I'm out in public. I'll give you tips for finding and creating an interesting composition, including how to choose and frame a focal point. And finally, I'll show you how I paint the scene using a limited palette of only 6 colors. Join me as I paint a typical scene in America. I'm visiting my mother in America, and I've come to a cafe to do some painting. It's a completely different experience than painting in England because the architecture is so much newer, and so that makes it a little bit trickier to find something really interesting, well, for me anyway. But I'm at a cafe now, and I'm going to go in and hopefully be able to find a nice view from the window. It's still pretty cold in the morning, so I think I'm going to take my drawing from the comfort of a cafe today. When I'm painting at a cafe, the first thing that I like to do is get myself a drink, and whilst I'm waiting for it to be made, I check out the area and try to find interesting views. I wasn't in the mood to paint an interior, and so I was looking out the windows and trying to find an interesting composition. And I settled on this view of the Walgreens that was across the street. It's sort of a Generica type of view in America, a building that has the dormers that I don't think are real, but add a little bit of aesthetic interest to the architecture. I especially liked the tree in the foreground and thought that added a bit of extra interest to the composition. I'm starting here by putting in the top of the roof line and also the angles of the peaked roofs. And I want to make sure to place this above the center point to keep the composition from being too dull or stagnant. This is a 2-point perspective, so I need to make sure that the roof line on the right angles slightly down towards the right. And I'll hold my pencil up to make sure that I get that angle correct. And as I put in a place marker for the traffic light, I notice that the building needs to move slightly further to the left, so I make that adjustment and then start to sketch in the main tree. The scene from my vantage point has the tree slightly to the right, so I'm putting in some of the main trunks and a few of the branches. I'm taking the time to make sure that all of the elements are placed in the correct position. And because the roof line is only slightly above the center point and the tree is only slightly to the right of the center, it's really crucial that I carefully place those before I go any further with the painting. There are many different elements that go into making sure that a painting is successful, but in my experience, the 2 main ones are having an interesting composition and representing a range of values accurately. If you can get those 2 things correct, I honestly believe that's half the battle. So I'm going slowly here, making sure that the angles are correct and making sure that the placement of all of the elements is as I see it in the scene in front of me. Sometimes it's possible to be a little more relaxed about these components, but this composition is a little bit more delicate. If I had placed that roof line even just a little bit lower and that tree a little bit further to the left, the whole composition would be thrown off. And it not only wouldn't be as interesting, but it would be unbalanced. There were a few things about this scene that caught my eye. One was the way that there are these subtle angles to the right and to the left, and also interspersed with that is the traffic light pole and how the connecting street sign angles slightly down towards it. There are quite a few small elements on that traffic light, and placing them slightly to the left keeps the eye moving and prevents it from getting stuck in any one area. And the tree being in the foreground is crucial for adding more visual interest. Without that tree there, this scene would be pretty boring. I always decide where I want the main focal point to be before I go in with my drawing. And for this little painting, I want the focal point to be the Walgreens sign and the traffic light that are slightly to the left of center. And so the roof line on the right angles slightly up and leads the eye towards that, and on the left, the roof line also angles slightly up. The traffic line angles slightly down, and the tree limbs on the left side of the tree also draw the eye in towards that direction. Even the little car that I put in on the right-hand side is pointed towards the focal point. And it's these little subtle elements that are going to make sure that the viewer experience is the most visually pleasing. Each drawing and painting is a different experience, but for this one, I spent the majority of the time using a .03 mechanical pencil to map out all of the elements, and then I've gone in with my fountain pen to add some darker values and shading. And even though the nib on my fountain pen is extra fine, I'm aware of the fact that this is a very tiny painting that is about 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, and so I have to be careful not to go overboard with the ink. I can always come back later and add more if I need to, but if it gets too dark and muddy before I even add the paint, I could get into real trouble. Once I've finished inking, I'm taking a kneaded eraser and erasing all of the pencil lines, especially the ones in the sky. I'll be using a limited palette for this painting. French Ultramarine is my only blue, and my reds are Transparent Red Oxide and Pyrrole Scarlet, and then I'm using 3 yellows, Transparent Yellow Oxide, Hansa Yellow Light, and New Gamboge. And I'll start by painting my base layer first. For this guy, I'm using the French Ultramarine with just a touch of the Transparent Red Oxide. I'm dabbing the sky color in and leaving some areas of the paper showing, and this will better convey the brightness of the day. And then into that mix, I'm adding a bit more of the Transparent Red Oxide and a touch of the Transparent Yellow Oxide to put down the first layer of the rooftops. The yellow is important because there's a little tint of yellow on the roof from the sunlight. I'm not worried about shadows in this stage. I'll be adding those and darkening values in the second and third layers. Instead, I'm most concerned about representing the brightest areas of the painting. So those brighter areas of the roof, and now the brighter areas of the building where the sunlight is shining directly on it. And so for the first base layer of the building, I'm using a mix of Transparent Red Oxide and Pyrrole Scarlet. And those colors won't look terribly bright when I first put them down, but when I go in later and add shadows and darker values, they're going to pop more. And into that first layer of the building, I'll add a second layer with some darker shadows. One of the things that really caught my eye with this composition was the strip of grass just below the building. So I've mixed a brighter green using some French Ultramarine and Hansa Yellow Light and put in those small but very important pops of green. And because green is the complement of red and there is some red in the brick of the building, those two colors being near one another are going to help emphasize the brightness of those areas. And then I'm adding some of the brighter colors that I see in that area of the focal point, which is a bit of yellow on the traffic light, and then brightening up where the sunlight is hitting the Walgreens sign in the front of the store. And so I'm adding another coat of the Transparent Red Oxide with some of the Pyrrole Scarlet to that area. And then I'm taking that same color and spreading the love a little bit. So I'm looking for other areas in the composition where I see that color and carefully dabbing it in. And this too will keep the eye moving around the page as well as add some visual harmony to the painting. And you can see at this stage that the painting is becoming very wet. So I'll add a few shadows around the car and a few more shadows to the roof, and then I need to walk away and allow the painting a bit of time to dry. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing because it's always helpful to step away from your painting a little bit and come and look at it again with fresh eyes. So once it's had some time to dry, I'm adding the darker shadows to the roof and also under the eaves of the building. If you like these narrated tiny painting videos, you might consider checking out my Patreon, where I have a collection of videos like this as well as others in color mixing and drawing. And there are a few areas where I lost some of the whites, so I'm just taking a white Posca pen and adding a few touches of white in some strategic areas, as well as adding some more ink with the fountain pen. I'm being extra careful with the tree to notice that there are some branches that are dark and some that are light. And by representing those, it's going to look more realistic and three-dimensional. I'm adding a few more golden pops of sunlight to some of these branches. And that's about it for this tiny painting. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's free, and I post a long video every Sunday as well as 4 short videos throughout the week. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Happy painting!